When it comes to quality sleep, Ashley has you covered with top mattress brands at winning prices and with special financing options available. You can snooze now and pay later. Plus, your mattress purchase helps give the gift of better sleep to children in need and U.S. Special Operations Forces. Visit your local Ashley store or shop online today and make every snooze count. Financing is subject to credit approval. See store or ashley.com for details.
Dreaming of overseas adventures or connecting more deeply with family from afar? Rosetta Stone bridges the language gap.
I've tried others, but Rosetta Stone's immersive lessons and voice feedback technology are game changers.
Dive into 25 languages by learning intuitively, just like when you were a kid. And here's the holiday sparkle. Grab a lifetime membership now and save 50%. Gift yourself the world. Head to rosettastone.com now and save 50%.
Welcome to True Crime Garage. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Nick, and with me, as always, is a man that butters his bread on both sides. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the captain.
Yeah, give me some of that tasty apple butter. It's good to be seen and good to see you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend.
Today we are drinking 7 Years by the Breton Brewing Company. This New England-style pale ale packs a lot of hop flavor without the bitterness, and that's because of the tropical fruit that they added. Berries and tangerine balance this baby out for a delicious finish. Garage grade 4 out of 5 bottle caps, and our fridge is full thanks to our friends right here. First up, a big cheers to Jordan Bonaparte from the Nighttime Podcast for sending us some delicious Canadian beers.
And a big shout out to Lauren in Hudson, New Hampshire.
Next up, here's a cheers to Lindsay in Fargo, North Dakota.
Old Fargo. And a big we like to jib to Alberto B. in Parts Unknown.
And also in Parts Unknown, we have Vanessa B. as well. Everyone we just mentioned, well, they went to our website, truecrimegarage.com. They clicked on the donate button and they helped us fill up the fridge for today's show. And for that, we thank you.
Yeah, BWERUN, Beer Run. If you're not a member of our mailing list, you need to do so today. Go to truecrimegarage.com and sign up on our mailing list. I'll be sending out a promo code to the store tonight. So look for that in your inbox. And if you have signed up and you don't receive that email, look in your spam box, or maybe you signed up with the wrong email address. So make sure you put the right email address in there. Colonel, that's enough of the business.
That's right. True Crime Garage creating all the spam. All right, everybody, gather around, grab a chair, grab a beer. Let's talk some true crime. Hello, Jamie. Thank you for joining me here in the garage today. I'm excited to talk about your new book, Madman in the Woods. It's quite the interesting story. It's quite the interesting life that you had. Really kind of scary when you think about how close you were to, well, the Madman in the Woods. Life next door to the Unabomber. Jamie is here to talk about her childhood and growing up next to Ted Kaczynski. As casual as this is, Jamie, and as short and simple to put it, you grew up next to a serial killer.
Yes, I sure did. I grew up just less than a quarter of a mile away from Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And sometimes when I say a quarter mile, people are like, "Oh, that seems actually kind of far," but it's rural Montana, and so you have to really think about the landscape there. And and just to give you a small amount of background, my family purchased about 9,000 acres of ranch land decades before Ted Kaczynski came to Lincoln. And in 1971, my grandfather sold 1.4 acre to Ted and David Kaczynski. And that 1.4 acre was on the fringe of our ranch land. And so since 1971 to 1996, when Ted was arrested, our family and Ted Kaczynski basically were sharing a backyard, and me specifically for most of my childhood.
You're quite a bit younger than Ted, so you're only living next door to him for what, about 15 years? Is that right?
Yeah, you're very close. I was born in 1980, and so he was arrested in 96. I was 16 years old when he was arrested.
And describe this area for us, the land that your family owned, and of course the 1.4 acres that Ted and his brother owned.
So the area that I am from, Lincoln, Montana, is very rural. Like it's about 1,000 residents, give or take, depending on the season. The town is very small. It has a blinking stoplight, not even red and green. It's so you can imagine, that it's very, very, very tidy. Where Ted specifically lived was close to 4 miles from the tiny town of Lincoln. Very
Mhm.
isolated, rural area, surrounded by pine trees. And when he bought that land in 1971, there were very few people living out there. And so obviously that really did appeal to him. As the years went on, there were a couple more neighbors here and there, but really there weren't, it wasn't very populated. So my family, my dad, of course, as seemingly fellow mountain men do, was always looking out for Ted and trying to help Ted because that's kind of how the community worked. And, because of that, they did form it almost, it seemed on the surface a friendship in those very early years. So, the place is very rural, but the community is very tight knit. And so my father really tried to care for Ted in the way that he would care for any other neighbor.
Yeah, Ted was a very interesting guy, a very odd character to really well, when we covered the Unabomber case a while back, a year or so ago, and I really dove into who he was and tried to get an opinion on his personality and his makeup, even, thousands of 1,000 miles away and all these years later, and really just what I could pull off of pages and not so much the experience you had where you met him face to face on multiple occasions and lived next door to him essentially. But the vibe I always kind of got, Jamie, was that here we have this guy that, yes, he moves out. You say rural, but like I live in a rural area of Ohio. To call your area rural and mine rural in the same sentence would be insanity, because to me, like, you guys are living out in the middle of nowhere pretty much. And for this guy to move out into the middle of nowhere, it gives you this vibe like, here's this dude that wants to just run away from everybody else, that he hates society, he hates all that in society entails, and he wants to be by himself, he wants to be left alone. But at the same time, I'm glad that you bring up what you did with your father, and the way that the mountain men would work, and they would check in on one another. And I imagine your father's going over there every couple of days or just dropping by when he happens to be in that corner of your guys' plot of land and saying, "Hey, Ted, how's it going? Any problems?" You just kind of check in with each other as neighbors would in any area, but it's more important here in this area because you're talking about a situation where somebody could, God forbid, they have a health situation and pass away. They could not be noticed for days or weeks if nobody's there to check on them, if not longer. But with Ted, I always kind of got this vibe that even though he's once and seems on the surface like he desires this hermit style of life, I do think just like every other human being, though, he was someone that needed some kind of interaction with others and actually desired it, even if he would tell us otherwise. I think he actually desired human interaction and really probably was starved for some type of meaningful friendship that he just didn't have and that maybe he didn't allow himself to have. And you met him face to face and your father knew him. Am I close to being right here?
Yeah, actually, I think you're pretty spot on, especially in what I call the early years for me. So the late 70s, early 80s, that is when Ted Kaczynski was still coming over to our family's home for dinner. He held me as a baby and asked to hold me. There were still late night card games between him and my parents. And in my book, and Madman in the Woods, I do really try to uncover that. Like, was it a cover for Ted? Was he trying to create this persona of being this, normal neighbor, or did he really still at that point have a desire for connection?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if we'll ever really get to the bottom of that answer, but there's still a part of me that really does believe that he still needed that. And even as the time went on, when he was deep into his reign of domestic terror, you can read his journals and sort of see that as well, because he's writing every single day. And when I say journals, they're basically stacks of notebooks that were found in his cabin. But he is detailing everything about his day, what he's eating, what he's hunting, what he's reading, and of course, his crimes as well. But when he writes, it's as though he's writing to an audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that also has always made me think that it was his own way of some sort of almost communication with the outside world. The only safe way he could do it.
Was almost to mimic like he's writing somebody a letter rather than keeping a personal journal.
Exactly. It was some sort of, in his mind, connection and communication with others, even though it really wasn't.
And that's interesting too, that he was doing that. And I was aware of these diaries. I kind of pictured him as being something a little bit different, but didn't do a whole lot of research into those particular diaries. So that's interesting to hear. And that to me, in some ways, reflects the typical behavior of a solitary man. We will see that similar behavior from inmates where they're locked up for long periods of days of the day, so they will write down and journal things that you and I would not. What I had for lunch, what time lunch was, what books I was reading, and so on and so forth. It's all these little minute insignificant details of their day, but it's a way to pass the time and to record the time in a way. But he's doing it in a way that it would be almost that he's presenting it to an audience, or that he's communicating with someone. And I think that goes back to what I was thinking and what you're hitting on there, that I do think in a way, as alone as he seemed to want to be on the surface, again, I do think he was starved for real relationships. I don't know that he had the ability to have them, or to have any type of lasting, meaningful relationship. It's almost like his personality was his own prison.
While writing the book, I did I connected with David Kaczynski, his brother, of course, and I mean that was one perspective that I found obvious for obvious reasons very interesting. And he, kind of said the same thing, especially with the isolation that Ted chose. He was really just stuck in the echo chamber of his own mind. And, who knows if that continued isolation fueled him even further with his campaign.
Did you meet his brother David before the rest of the world knew what Ted was up to?
No, I didn't. So Ted and David and his parents had come out to Lincoln in the early 80s for a few visits. But we actually did not meet them and did not see them. But Ted definitely destroyed that relationship. And the last time the Kaczynskis came out was the mid 80s. And after that, Ted decided that he didn't want anything to do with his family. So we did not know them. And there were very strange encounters as a child with Ted. And many times he would come to our home and knock on the door and ask what time it was, what day it was. And so I would tell him, and his reason for many of those encounters would be because he needed to go pick up his brother from town. And it was really interesting because when I was writing the book and talking with David, I had told him about that, and he was like, "Oh, that's definitely very strange because the last time I came to visit, was the mid 80s, and this was definitely happening past that into the 90s." And so that always made me really wonder too. And something that I wrote about as well is if he's still in part of his mind had the desire to see his brother because it was such a strange thing to say. Or again, if it was just a cover because he needed to know what time it was truly because he was potentially catching the bus to go plant a bomb. So, yeah, very, very strange things from my childhood once we, as an adult, can really look back and uncover what was truly going on.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's either a cover or, like you said, he still had the desire to be close to his brother, who we know he was close with at one point in his life, and we know that David helped him build the shack or whatever we want to call it that Ted was
Yeah.
living in. That's interesting about kind of having a cover for catching the bus to plant these bombs. But we do know that Ted was riding his bike into town on occasion to for the post office. Like where I live and where most people live, there's a wonderful lady or man that drives around in a little truck and hands out the mail and puts it in mailboxes and such. But in these smaller communities, you have to go to the post office not just to send something out, but to retrieve your own mail. And so Ted would he would ride into town on his bicycle to pick up mail, drop off mail. And I believe he was visiting a very small library that was in town.
Yeah, so Ted would go in and out of the town of Lincoln, um, and he actually did have a mailbox on the road outside of his home
Oh,
with
okay.
his name on it. But he also, you're right, he did also have a PO box. And in reading some of the letters, the correspondence between him and his parents, his mom specifically, there were some times where Wanda Kaczynski, his mother, had sent dried fruit or some sort of provisions in a package to him, and the box was too large to fit into his mailbox. And so they held it at the post office, and Ted would have to go down there, ride his bike, or walk down, and it enraged him. I mean, reading the scathing words was really actually pretty difficult, um, to see what he would write to his own mother. But I mean, looking back now, you can see, I mean, obviously it's the Unabomber, so there's a little mix of whatever's going on there with some potential mental illness and the isolation. So it's easy to see where the words are coming from. But anyway, he would have to walk or ride his bike into town and go to the post office, but he would also take time to go into the Lincoln Library. He would sometimes go into the grocery store, or Garland's Town and Country, as it was called back then, which was like a general store. And at those locations, he did have people that he would sit and talk to. He had
Mhm.
found, just a few people in town that he was comfortable conversing with. But it was very, very few.
As much as he refused to believe that he was crazy, and you're calling him the madman, and I actually believe that he was very deep in psychosis by the time that he was apprehended. It's difficult to, I think it probably started rather young, maybe in his teens or early 20s, and I think it becomes a slippery slope that you just keep falling down a little bit more. And I understand that every case is different, but I'm looking at Ted specifically, and I just wonder with the oh, I have to pick up my brother, if it was more of, could have been his mental illness kicking in, of retrieving mail, or hoping to retrieve something from his brother in town. Talk about some of his, you said he would come over and play cards. I would imagine it's difficult playing cards against someone with a genius level IQ. Talk about some of your interactions with him at the house. What do you remember in your young childhood sharing a meal with the Unabomber? I would imagine as a young girl, you're probably sitting there watching Dad and Ted talk about, all sorts of things.
So when Ted Kaczynski was coming to our home for meals still, I was a
Mhm.
baby, so I don't
Okay.
remember those visits. But in writing the book, I got to sit down with my mom, and she was able to really detail what that looked like and what that felt like, which was very compelling because, you know, in those early years, as you were saying, through the years, he was probably deep into his psychosis when he was coming by and asking the time and such. But when he first came to Lincoln, he made it very clear in these journals that his motivation for choosing this lifestyle was revenge, even in 1971. So that was still very present, but he still had the appearance of the Berkeley professor a bit. He
Hmm.
didn't, he didn't quite look like the man that was pulled from his cabin in 1996, completely disheveled with his clothes rotting off and, soot on his face. So in the early years, when Ted would come over, he was always a bit strange. And my first memories of him, I don't when I really truly look at them, I wasn't scared. I wasn't there was no fear present when he was at the house, or when he came over to help my dad and things like that.
Hmm.
But definitely as the years went on, those visits became much more alarming.
And did your parents try to keep him at a distance at some point?
Yes, they did. My mom and my father did get divorced in the 80s, and my dad remarried. And my stepmother didn't have quite the relationship with Ted as my mom did. And so there was definitely a change in that dynamic. When Ted would come over, it just wasn't quite the same. He wasn't coming over for dinner at that point. He was, there I talk about in the book, there was a day where he actually worked on my dad's sawmill, and
Hmm.
my stepmother Wendy was his boss, and it made for a pretty difficult day of of labor for all of them. The dynamic definitely changed in our, in our family over the years. And Ted wasn't quite as friendly with my parents, and there were plenty of disagreements between my father and Ted, especially in the 90s, as Ted's reign of terror continued, and of course as his mental illness probably deepened.
So we talk about disagreements with your father and Ted, but there was some strange things going on that at the time probably seemed very strange and maybe random, but then later knowing who Ted actually is, you have to have your suspicions that maybe Ted was involved or the sole perpetrator of some of these items. So let's talk about two strange events in particular. Would be there was some kind of sabotage at your father's sawmill, which I believe that was covered in one of the maybe the Netflix special, and then your this is incredibly terrible, but the your family dog was poisoned at some point.
Yeah, so there were plenty of acts of sabotage in the Lincoln area that I uncovered while writing this book. And of course, I can't say for sure that Ted was responsible for all of them, but there were a few definitely that he admitted to. And one of those, yes, was the sabotage of my father's sawmill. It was sanded, which just means that, somebody had put sand into the gas tank, and we didn't know at the time who that was. My dad initially he did have some suspicion that it may be Ted, and had confided in one of our neighbors, like, oh, he said, I don't trust him. I don't know why. And the neighbor, Chris, was like, oh, Ted couldn't do that. Think about it. Like, he's just an eccentric hermit. My dad finally kind of accepted that and moved on. I will be honest, when he was arrested, of course, we were like, oh, that was most likely Ted. But I didn't know that it was absolutely 100% Ted Kaczynski
Hmm.
until participating in the Netflix documentary and hearing the interview that's on that doc. And Ted is bragging about it and admitting to it and saying, that I think he calls my dad an asshole, and just says something like, I have this neighbor, Butch Gehring, who's an asshole, or something like that. And, my goal was to put him out of business. And so hearing that and hearing what he did could finally, provide some like concrete closure. And, my dad has passed away, and I really wish that he was able to hear that, because it would have really, confirmed a lot of his thoughts through the years. I mean, obviously the arrest was a big wake up call for everybody, and had solved some mysteries for sure. But that specifically wasn't uncovered until the documentary aired. So yeah, that was one, and then there was another pretty horrific event. I mean, when I was writing this book, I had interviewed other neighbors and was hearing all of these horrific stories of other pets in the area being poisoned, and pets being stabbed, and horrible deaths and such. Our dog Wiley had been poisoned and had a pretty slow death. But at the time, the veterinarian had confirmed that it was strychnine that the dog had ingested. And as horrible as that was, and I definitely had some, I guess, concerns that it was Ted Kaczynski. There was strychnine found at his home when the FBI searched the cabin. it wasn't again until I was writing this that I found a letter that Ted admits to killing a dog, a neighbor's dog, that was sneaking into his garden at night. I think that was, I mean, it was a difficult moment for me for sure, because I know this sounds really odd, but knowing a killer as a child is, I mean, to put it lightly, a very strange experience and a hard thing to reconcile as an adult, because I do have these softer memories of him, and I saw him through this different lens, and I trusted him as a little kid. And finding these things out and knowing, seeing the concrete evidence of really what he was capable of, and really what danger we were in living so close to him, um, was was just a really hard part of this whole process.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you look forward to the holidays? Maybe you struggle with seasonal blues. This time of year can be a lot, and it's natural to feel some sadness or even anxiety about it. But adding something new and positive to your life can counteract some of those feelings. Therapy can be a bright spot, something to look forward to make you feel grounded, and to give you the tools to manage everything going on. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find your bright spot this season with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/garage today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/garage.
Rosetta Stone is the language learning program with a lasting impact. I've been using their app to learn French, and it's not just about memorizing words, but actually having real conversations. And it's not just French. They offer 25 languages. Right now, Rosetta Stone has an awesome holiday deal, 50% off their lifetime membership. Every language, unlimited access forever. For anyone keen on diving deep into a new language, check out rosettastone.com. It's a game changer.
When it comes to teaching kids and teens about money, practice makes perfect. That's where Greenlight comes in. With a debit card and money app of their own, kids learn to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest. Parents send instant money transfers, create custom chores, and automate allowance, while kids track their spending, set savings goals, and practice money skills they can use today and for life. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.
Angie's List is now Angie, and we've heard a lot of theories about why.
I thought it was an eco move. Fewer words, less paper.
No, it was so you could say it faster.
No, it's to be more iconic.
Must be a tech thing.
But those aren't quite right. It's because now you can compare upfront prices, book a service instantly, and even get your project handled from start to finish.
Sounds easy.
It is, and it makes us so much more than just a list. Get started at Angie.com. That's ANGI, or download the app today.
All right, let's get back to Nick's interview with Jamie, the author of Madman in the Woods, talking about Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski.
Yeah, I can hear the inner struggle that you have there, and it's something that I can't, nobody can take away from you, or nobody can relieve you of that. But it's something I really wish that it's one of those situations where that's what separates you from Ted. That's what separates me and you and a whole bunch of other people from somebody like Ted, where you have enough compassion in your heart and empathy that for somebody that you can look back on somebody as terrible as this man is and as horrible as his deeds were and as evil as he was, that you still look back and go, he wasn't always bad, or there was some good in him, or there was something that you saw that wasn't pure evil. And he would never feel that way for any of us.
Right.
And so it's hard to really kind of wrap your head around that. But when we talk about the destruction to your father's sawmill and a dog being poisoned, maybe he poisoned other dogs as well. Ted was his makeup, especially the older he got, to me, was just somebody that was so incredibly jealous, spiteful, and hell-bent on revenge. I think it rings true when we hear him say years later, "Oh, this man that I live next to, he was an asshole, and I happily put sand in the sawmill and tried to take down his operation," because that's who he is. He's hell-bent on revenge, and he personally feels, "Oh, I bested that man. I won. In the end, I won, even though I didn't play fair, even though I played dirty. And oh, by the way, we were in some weird competition that this other guy was even unaware of. And I was jealous of him for reasons that he would never even know or understand. But oh, in the end, it doesn't matter because I won. I bested him." That's really, to me, what a lot of his destruction and chaos and death that he caused was all about. And so many people, and this, we talk about difficult to wrap your head around. So many people, you see them on the internet go, "Oh, if anybody would take the time to read his manifesto, you would realize how brilliant and how smart and forward thinking this guy was." And I read the manifesto, and the whole time I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, he sent bombs to people and with total reckless regard for any human life. We are lucky that he only killed the number that he killed. The number could have been so much higher, just
Yeah.
based off a circumstance that was out of Ted's control. And so you sit there and you read his manifesto and you go, this guy is a walking contradiction to everything that he put in these papers. There's no brilliance there. Nobody's arguing that he has 167 IQ, but I would argue, what kind of real brilliance and beliefs did this guy have other than the core of it all? At the core of it all, I see a weak man who has no self-respect and has shunned himself from his family by his own choice, but blames his family that he doesn't fit in with them. Just like he blamed your family that he didn't fit in with you. He's hell-bent on jealousy and revenge and spitefulness that led him down this horrible, dark, destructive path. Now, the other thing too, though, you mentioned that there were weird meetings in the woods with Ted, or hearing strange noises at night.
Yeah, there was multiple events when I was really small, that I was about 5 when it first started happening. I was laying in my bed, and my bedroom faced kind of the mountainside, and behind our home there were some old cars. And my dad had an old Oldsmobile he was planning on fixing, and his boat, and various pieces and parts for the sawmill and things like that. And that was very close to my bedroom window. And I would start hearing something outside of my window, and it wasn't an animal. I knew that much. I would hear like rustling, I would hear metal clanging against each other. I started to hear very light whistling. I would always sleep with my bedroom window open because even as a little kid, I really loved the wind and the smell of the pines. I started waking up to these noises outside, and I was terrified. And I would run into my dad's bedroom and yell, "There's a monster outside." And my dad, of course, would be like, "Oh no, it's just your overactive imagination. Climb into bed." And I was like, "No, Dad, there's really somebody out there." And I think he did appease me a few times and would like walk over to my room and be like, "No, nobody's here," and come back in as you do with little kids. But, as Ted writes in his journals, he was foraging for scraps and pieces to put in his bombs. And much of the reason he was untraceable for so long, because he wasn't buying supplies anywhere that could be traced for his bombs. He was finding the majority of the metal and, of course, wood that he was using around his home. Knowing that now as an adult, and knowing that I was really hearing a monster outside my window, was I think it was just a real moment of clarity for me. And I finally, as an adult, I could kind of put that to rest, and to like know that I was right, and I knew something was amiss. But I was just a kid. So that, although a scary experience, was really kind of, I suppose, empowering for me as an adult to write about it and know that I had the intuition, to know that something was wrong. So yeah, that was one experience, and then there was another one as I was much older. It was actually just the year prior to Ted's arrest that I was taking a walk through our woods, which I did all the time, and I was rounding a corner, almost collided with Ted. And here we are, both alone in the woods together. And he is much more at this point like the man that you saw being pulled out of his cabin in 1996. He's
Describe him a little bit for us.
Yeah, so he's completely disheveled. He's got, holes in his clothing. He's got soot. He always had soot on his face, dirt under his fingernails. But at this point, his eyes were really bulging. He just seemed like almost, agitated and frantic. His just demeanor was completely different from kind of the shy, reserved, eccentric hermit that I initially had known as a little kid. And so just his appearance was much more frightening. There was gray in his beard, his hair was sticking up all over the place. And, of course, at this point, I understood a bit more about the world around me than I did when I was 4. And so being alone in the woods with him was frightening on its own. But also there was just something about him that really scared me at that point. And, it's just one of those moments where the hair on the back of your neck is sticking up, and you're scared for a reason. It's intuition. And so, we both said hello as best as possible, turned around. He went back his way. I went back to my house. And the entire time I was running back to the home as soon as I knew that he couldn't see me anymore, or thought he couldn't see me, and was looking over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't behind me. So that was one of those other, really frightening experiences as an adult, looking back on that and thinking how differently that could have gone. I mean, he was killing, he was maiming, he was, he had been a domestic terrorist for almost 2 decades at that point.
You talk about being scared. You're meeting him in the woods, and now, forgive me for a little bit. I might use a little language that we don't want, but one of his journals. One thing that struck me when researching Ted and his crimes and his life and his lifestyle a little bit was in one of his journals, and I don't know if this was made up for the media or if this is real, and you may know, but it was referenced that he at one point was sitting in the woods with his rifle considering shooting the neighbor's daughter. I think he even says something extremely vulgar like I thought about killing the bitch or shooting the little bitch. Was he talking about you? And is that true? Do we know if that's true?
So you're right about that. And I do talk about that in Madman in the Woods. It was one of the more difficult things for me to write about. And the the way it happened is that, yes, Ted was in the woods with his rifle, and in that 10 by 12 cabin in Lincoln, Montana, he did have rifles. He
Hmm.
had a pistol that he had made himself. And as you know, when he was arrested, he also had a bomb that was packaged and ready to be sent. So there were plenty of terrifying things within that cabin and within those woods. And on one particular day, Ted was out in our shared backyard with his rifle. And since our land surrounded his, my stepmother and my little sister, who was only 2 at the time, they were out doing some chores and kind of reseeding the ground, and my stepmother just felt something. She felt something ominous. She felt a presence. And you're in the middle of the woods, and you think you're in Montana, it's maybe a mountain lion, there's a predator of some sort. So she grabbed her daughter, got her in the truck, and they left. Well, she didn't think about this again until after Ted's arrest. And in those journals, which my especially my father was very involved in the investigation, but they were able to read some of those, and my stepmother remembers reading that Ted had a rifle pointed on her. And yes, he was kind of vacillating between my stepmother and my little sister, who's a toddler, really contemplating killing them. And
Oh,
yes,
wow.
you're right. So while he's looking through the scope and thinking about, killing close range, he's in his journals later talking about if he killed bitch one, then bitch two would be left on the mountainside. I mean, just the way that he talks about it is horrific. And for obvious reasons, that was really, really difficult to write about.
Of course, and I mean, it doesn't get any scarier than that. Now, your father, we have him playing a role in taking down Ted. We have FBI agent Max Knoll says that your father was the eyes and ears of a portion of their investigation. Can you tell us about your father's role and maybe anything you witnessed or learned about after the fact?
Yes, the Unabomb case was, very sensitive for many reasons, but because of Ted's isolation and because of the environment he lived in, he's surrounded by trees. He's surrounded by mountains and trees, and hardly anybody lives out there. He being Max Knoll, knew that he was going to need some help. And
Mhm.
my father ended up being that person. And of course, the FBI had to first determine if they could trust my father, and that didn't take that didn't take very long. It just took a conversation. My dad ended up, yes, being kind of the eyes and ears, because any other person around the cabin would have raised suspicion. During that time, when Max Knoll was planning the investigation and, really trying to figure out how they were going to arrest this man, it was, they were looking back on Ruby Ridge and Waco, and they didn't want any casualties. They didn't want, Ted to be killed, and they didn't want, obviously, the FBI to be harmed. And so they had to be really strategic. And
Mhm.
my father was, as you said, the eyes and ears. He would report back to Max, if there was smoke coming out of the chimney, or if There were footsteps coming out of the cabin, things like that in the beginning. And then as the investigation continued, the FBI was having a really difficult time getting images, even aerial images. And so, my dad actually went and walked the grounds, walked around Ted's cabin with his handheld video camera and taped the terrain for the FBI in preparation of the arrest. So they knew exactly what it looked like. So that was definitely, as even my dad would admit, a very scary part of the investigation, because my dad knew at that point. They had shared with him, they they slowly kind of told him what they were suspecting Ted of, but initially it was they were just looking into Ted Kaczynski for writing some threatening letters, and then it did come out that in fact they thought he was the Unabomber. So my dad knew at that point when he was walking around Ted's cabin with this. And you think about in the 90s what a handheld video camera looked like. It wasn't like your
Right.
small little iPhone. And so he's walking around this serial killer's home in the middle of the woods where he knows that he has rifles. He hunts. He doesn't know all of the contents of his cabin, but he was terrified. But he knew that he had no other choice, and he couldn't see one more person hurt, so he did it.
Yeah. And Jamie, I want to thank you so much for talking with us about your wonderful book, your fascinating book, Madman in the Woods, the life next door to the Unabomber. There's really dozens of things that we could go into that you do go into in your book, and it's a fascinating read. So I want to congratulate you on that. One thing I want to leave a little bit of a cliffhanger for everybody out there in listener land is I'm sure everybody will be dying to know what happened when you wrote to Ted in prison after his arrest, but we won't give that answer here today. Instead, why don't we tell everybody where they can find this incredible book?
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words on the book. I really do appreciate that. My book can be found basically anywhere you buy your books, any brick and mortar that you like to shop at, but also, of course, online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and then, of course, my website as well, jamiegehring.com.
Wonderful. Thank you again for joining us, and congratulations on the book. And I hope to come back and talk to us again sometime.
Thank you so much.
Old Ted Kaczynski, Madman in the Woods. Fascinating stuff. Colonel, do we have any recommended reading for the beautiful listeners?
Of course we do here, Captain. We're going to be recommending Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabomber by our guest, Jamie. As a child in Lincoln, Montana, growing up, her family shared their land, their home, and their dinner table with a hermit with a penchant for murder. And that, of course, was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Check out her book, her fantastically intriguing book, Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabomber. You can find that great title and many more on our recommended page at truecrimegarage.com.
Join us back here in the garage next week, and until then, be good, be kind, and don't litter.
When it comes to teaching kids and teens about money, practice makes perfect. That's where Greenlight comes in. With a debit card and money app of their own, kids learn to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest. Parents send instant money transfers, create custom chores, and automate allowance, while kids track their spending, set savings goals, and practice money skills they can use today and for life. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.